Alright, I want to start off by giving all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Baharaka Kodash, and double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Stone, and salutations to the Akim out there who pushes his word sincerely and in truth, and to the rest of the 1/3 men, women, and children whom the Lord has foreordained to receive mercy in these last days. Now, in this video, I wanted to get into some history, that I stumbled across, a couple days ago, and it's history concerning the so-called Native Americans, which make up parts of the northern kingdom of Israel, Reuben and so on and so forth, right? Pretty much the history is going into Native American slave ownership, and also the fact that the northern kingdom were oppressed along with Judah, right? AKA the southern kingdom, right? But it's also going to go into the fact that some Native American families, some quote-unquote civilized Native American families actually owned slaves, and we will get into why that history is, right? So let's start here with it's a Wikipedia article entitled Native American Slave Ownership, right? I'll put the link in the description of the video once I upload it, Lord willing. Right, so it says Native American slave ownership refers to the ownership of enslaved Africans, which were the Israelites, from the kingdom of Judah, right, and Native Americans by Native Americans from the pre-colonial era to the U.S. Civil War, right, and those Native Americans again, were from the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and so on, right. It says so following this development, many indigenous tribes began to acquire Africans, which we know are the, again, Kingdom of Judah, right, as slaves. Many prominent people from the 5 civilized tribes, quote-unquote civilized tribes, purchased slaves from their white neighbors and became members of the planter class. Now, if you go into the history of the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes, let me just touch into it a little bit, right? The 5 civilized tribes the term was applied by European Americans in the colonial and early federal period in the history of the United States to the 5 major Native American nations to the southeast, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, right? And it says Americans of European descent classified them as civilized because they had adopted attributes of the Anglo-American culture. Examples of such colonial attributes adopted by these 5 tribes included Christianity, centralized government, literacy in English, market participation, written constitutions, and importantly, 2 most important ones at the end, intermarriage with white Americans and chattel slavery practices, including the purchase of enslaved African Americans. Now, one of the most well-known Cherokee chiefs from this time period was a man by the name of John Ross. And if you look up his lineage, John Ross was actually the son of a white man and a half Cherokee woman, right? So she wasn't even full Israelite. And his father was an Edomite. He was a white-skinned and blue-eyed man, but he was one of the chiefs, of the Cherokee nation, right? So what you notice is that a lot of the leaders of these quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes were actually Edomites, right? They intermarried with the women, right? The Edomite men intermarried with the Jake women, of the Indian tribes, and had children, and those children were fair-skinned, blue-eyed, all right, and came up to be leaders of the tribes, right? So what happened was that Esau infiltrated those tribes, right, and indoctrinated them, right? And yes, he had some among them, who readily took on, to the customs, right, just like they did in the Maccabees, which we're going to read that example, right? This is 1 Maccabees 1 verse 10, and there came out of them a wicked root, Antiochus surnamed Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the king, who had been hostage at Rome, and he reigned the 130th and 7th year in the kingdom of the Greeks. In those days there went out of Israel wicked men who persuaded many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are round about us, for since we departed from them, we had much sorrow, right? So just like it happened back then with the Greek Empire, it happened also with the so-called American Europeans, right, that came over, to the West. The so-called Indian tribes made covenants with them, right, to be like them, and a lot of times they were even forced to be like them. You have children that were forcibly taken from families and placed in so-called Indian schools to civilize them. All these different histories happened, but you don't really hear that on mainstream news, right? But let's get into it a bit more. All right, so that's the 5 civilized tribes. So remember that, right? They were cultivated by the so-called white man. A lot of intermarrying happened, which meant that a lot of chiefs were actually Edomite men. Let's read on. So we're gonna go to the background of Indians owning so-called blacks, right? It says holding slavery was not a new concept to the indigenous people, right? Which is not a new concept to Israelites in general, right? It says intra-indigenous slavery also occurred in the Pacific Northwest and in Alaska, right? And in inter-Native American conflict, tribes often kept prisoners of war. These captives often replaced slain tribe members, right? So, for example, if you had a husband that was lost in war, a prisoner of war would serve as the husband, the replacement husband, to bring up children for that man that died in war. And that's a custom of Israel. That's similar to a custom of Israel. All right, reading on, it says African Americans and natives have interacted for centuries. The earliest record of Native American and African contact occurred in April 1502 when Spanish colonists transported the first Africans to Hispaniola to be held and work in slavery. Some scholars argue that because of the similarities between some Africans and Native American cultural artifacts, that the two groups had likely had transatlantic encounters before European discovery of the Americas. This cannot, however, be proven. It can be proven through the scriptures, right? Because we can get here in 2nd Ezra chapter 13, right, where it speaks about the 10 tribes, which are Israelites, coming over here in the Americas. This is 2nd Ezra 13, verse 39. And whereas thou sawest that he gathered unto him another piece of a multitude, these are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Uzziah, the king whom Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, led away captive, and he carried them over the waters, and so they came into another land. But they took counsel amongst themselves that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into another country where never mankind dwelt, that they may there keep their statutes which they never kept in their own land. Right? It says, and they entered into the Euphrates by the narrow passages of the river, for the Most High shewed them signs for them, and held the flood still, till they were passed over, for through that country there was a great way to go, namely 1.5 years, and the same region was called Ashereth, right, which means another land, right, right, and that's pretty much America, right? So the reason why there is similarity between the cultural artifacts between the so-called Native Americans and the so-called Africans, because both are Israelites, right? And this is another example that proves that, right? Reading on, it says Native Americans and Africans had many interactions as parallel oppressed communities, right? Meaning they were what? They were enslaved together, and we can even get that from the scriptures, right? This is Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 33. It says, thus saith the Lord of hosts, the children of Israel and the children of Judah were oppressed together, and all that took them captive held them fast. They refused to let them go. That didn't happen in the original Babylon where Jeremiah lived, right? That happened now, right? That happened during the transatlantic slave trade, during the 16, 17, from the 15, 16, 17, 1800s. That's when that happened. Right? That happened over here in the New Babylon. Right? The Redeemer is strong, the Lord of hosts is his name. He shall thoroughly plead their cause, that he might give them rest and disquiet the inhabitants of Babylon. And that Babylon is talking about this Babylon right now. Right? So that's where they were oppressed together. Right? And this Wikipedia article is proving that. Right? Let me read it again. It says, Native Americans and Africans had many interactions as parallel oppressed communities, meaning they were oppressed together, right? Before the jumpstart of the Atlantic slave trade, European settlers enslaved many Native Americans, right? And major European held colonies such as Virginia and South Carolina enslaved thousands of Native Americans in the late 1600s to 1700s, with the occurrence of enslavement, right, continuing into the 1800s. It says Andres Reséndez estimates that between 147,000, right, 147 years get hot. I have to turn on the car, right? It says read where I am again. Yeah, Andres Reséndez, which is a historian, estimates that between 147,000 and 340,000 Native Americans were enslaved in America, excluding Mexico. According to the National Park Service, Native Americans during the transitional period of Africans becoming the primary race enslaved were enslaved at the same time, right? Right? And had a shared common experience of enslavements, right? They worked together, they lived together in communal quarters, produced collective recipes for food, shared herbal remedies, myths, and legend, and in the end they intermarried. That's between the Native American Indians and the so-called Black Africans, right? Which we know are the northern and southern members of the northern and southern kingdom, right? Because of a shortage of men during warfare, many tribes encouraged marriage between the two groups to create stronger, healthier children from the union. However, and this is why they ended up civilizing those quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes, right, and encourage them to enslave, so-called Africans. This is what happens. I'm gonna read it, right, and it's gonna ring a bell. However, Europeans considered both races inferior and made efforts to make both Native Americans and Africans enemies, right? Because of European fears of a unified revolt of Native Americans and African Americans, the colonists encouraged hostility between the groups. Whites sought to convince Native Americans that African Americans worked against their best interests. In 1751, South Carolina law stated, the carrying of Negroes among the Indians has all along been thought detrimental, as an intimacy ought to be avoided, right? In addition, in 1758, the governor of South Carolina, James Glenn, wrote, it has always been the policy of this government to create an aversion in them Indians to Negroes. Let's look up the word aversion, right? The word aversion here means dislike or strong dislike of, right? So they wanted to, so they made sure as government policy to create divisions between the so-called Native Americans, and the so-called Africans, right? So that's why they ended up doing what? They ended up quote-unquote civilizing some of the families of the northern tribe, right, and encourage them to own blacks as slaves, so-called blacks as slaves. That's why you ended up with some of them families owning, members of the Southern Kingdom. And like I said, a lot of the chiefs, a lot of the wealthy families, the prominent families among the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes were actually Edomites, right? For example, John Ross, which is one of the most celebrated Cherokee chiefs, was actually an Edomite. He was the son of a Scottish and a half Cherokee woman, right? So he was actually an Edomite, right? And if you look at pictures or read about descriptions, he was white-skinned and blue-eyed, right? He was white-skinned and blue-eyed, and that's not a unique case, right? So that's what happened there, right? They stirred up that old jealousy between Judah and Ephraim, and we're going to read about that here in a few scriptures, right? This is Isaiah 11 and verse 13. It says, the envy also of Ephraim shall depart, and the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not vex Ephraim. Right? So this is speaking about when Yahushua comes back and delivers us. He's going to remove that enmity. Right? Let's read an example of where that enmity surfaced itself. Enmity between the tribes. Right? This is Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 1. And the section is entitled War Against Jerusalem. And it came to pass in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Judah, king of Israel, Salakia, went up toward Jerusalem to war against it, but could not prevail against it, right? So this is the kingdom of Israel, which is the northern kingdom, right, making a unity with Syria to come against the kingdom of Judah, right? It says, and it was told the house of David, saying, Syria is confederate with Ephraim, and his heart was moved, and the heart of his people, as the trees of the wood are moved in the wind. Then said the Lord unto Isaiah, go forth to meet Ahaz, thou and Shear-Jashub thy son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool, in the highway of the fuller's field, and say unto him, take heed and be quiet, fear not, neither be faint-hearted, for the two tails of these smoking firebrands, for the fierce anger of Rezin and with Syria, and of the son of Remaliah. Because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have taken evil counsel against thee, saying, let us go up against Judah and vex it, and let us make a breach therein for us, and set a king in the midst of it, even the son of Tabeal. Right? So this is an example of the children, right, of Israel, the northern kingdom, coming against the southern kingdom, that enmity, right? And that's that old enmity that they stirred up, right, in this 17 and 1800s, right? Let's read again here in Jeremiah chapter 3 verse 8, right? And we're gonna show you, pretty much that they coming back together, right? Matter of fact, let me go to Hosea chapter 1 and 11 first. It says, then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together, right, and appoint themselves one head, and they shall come out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel, which means Yazrai Allah, the seed of Israel, right? And again, how could we not read Ezekiel 37 verse 16? Moreover, so thou son of man, take thee one stick, write upon it for Judah and for the children of Israel his companions, then take another stick and write upon it for Joseph the stick of Ephraim, and for the house of Israel his companions, and join them one to another into one stick, and they shall become one in thine hand. And when the people and the children of thy people shall speak unto thee, saying, wilt thou not show it what thou meanest by these? Say unto them, thus saith the Lord God, Yahweh, behold, I will take the stick of Joseph which is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel his fellows, and I will put them with him, even with the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, and they shall be one in mine hand. And the stick whereon thou writest shall be in thine hand before thine eyes. And say unto them, thus saith the Lord Yahweh, behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen, whither they have gone, and will gather them on every side, and bring them into their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land of Israel, and in the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king to them all, and there shall be no more two nations, neither shall they be divided into two kingdoms anymore. Right? So we read about an example of that, right, during the 17 and 1800s, where there was division, and it was primarily sown, by the Edomites, by the so-called European Americans, right, to quote unquote civilize, or indoctrinate, members of the quote unquote 5 civilized family, intermarry among them, lead their tribes, and have them purchase, so-called Africans as slaves, So that's pretty much what I want to bring out. I believe is there any precept? Yeah, we can bring out Jeremiah 3 verse 18. It says, in those days the house of Judah shall walk with the house of Israel. They shall come together out of the land of the north, right? And the land of the north is speaking about what? America, Mystery Babylon the Great, right? They shall come together out of the land of the north to the land that I have given for an inheritance to your father. And that's speaking about the land of Israel, right? So that's pretty much what I want to bring out. Hopefully it was edifying to the spirit. Until next time, Shalom.